Hello. So it's now the 30th of April 2019, and Theresa May is coming up to match the time of office that Gordon Brown was in 10 Downing Street for, just under 3 years. In fact, currently she ranks between Spencer Perceval and Gordon Brown. If you look at the list on Wikipedia, length of tenures of prime ministers, she's currently between, like I say, Spencer Perceval and Gordon Brown. That's a relatively short premiership, given that she's announced that she's going to resign, but with no specific date. One can assume that that will be before the next general election. Um, I think my own theory with May is that whilst it's not easy for any prime minister, obviously, to be forced from office, I think in her case it's particularly galling because she knows that there's history there. She's only the second woman in the office. Margaret Thatcher, of course, was in power for 11 and a half years. So it would be hard to believe that there isn't some sort of reflection on that from Theresa May's point of view. That as the second woman prime minister, she is only in for a third of the time of her predecessor. So that's maybe why May is being so recalcitrant about giving an exact date. I don't know. That's just speculation. Anyway, it seems a good time to talk about some of the people that have been named as potential successors. Now, a few disclaimers here. This is very, very basic. I'm not getting into any in depth analysis here. It's purely surface analysis. It's purely my thoughts right now about some of the people that have been named, um, who would then go on to become our 55th Prime Minister. Sometimes you hear, in terms of the numeracy, the office was never set up as a designated office, unlike, for example, presidential systems. Our office was never set up as the prime minister. That's something that kind of evolved. In fact, the term wasn't formally used until um, Campbell Bannerman's era at the turn of the last century. So that's interesting. First Lord of the Treasury was always a formal term, and there were a few people like the Earl of Iddesleigh who were First Lords of the Treasury but not Prime Minister. So there's a little bit of crossover there. That's just a little bit of constitutional history. But if you generally regard Sir Robert Walpole as the first Prime Minister, then we've had 54 up to Theresa May. I think that's the most widely accepted figure. Some figures are a bit higher, like she's the 76th Prime Minister and so on. But I would go with that figure of 54th. So the next Prime Minister will be our 55th Prime Minister. Leading the United Kingdom is it's an incredibly difficult job at any time, but particularly throughout Brexit. Um, this is the most complex situation, in my opinion, facing any government, at least on a domestic and trade point of view, since World War II. Um, and even World War II was a war context. So it's one of the most complex situations facing any prime minister ever. So when I see people say things like, "Oh, why not just do the simple process of pulling us out?" I really despair that they could be so frankly simple-minded to assume that this is a simple process. It really isn't. Um, Not without consequence. You cannot have a no deal Brexit without significant consequence. And it's the responsibility of a prime minister to reflect on what consequences that will then take. I get that people are impatient, but it is also their job to be responsible for what happens afterwards. Um, that just goes without saying. So I want to let me get into the brief analysis here. There's a lot of names that have been going around as potential next leaders of the Conservative Party and therefore Prime Minister. This is assuming, of course, that there isn't a general election which Jeremy Corbyn wins. It may be that the Tories are reluctant to have a leadership change without really knowing that the person can beat Jeremy Corbyn, or if they do, for the sake of argument, have a leadership change, let's say in the next few months, and let's say general elections called in early 2020, and Corbyn beats that person, they would be one of the shortest serving prime ministers in history, along with George Canning. So that's definitely something. Viscount Godric also only served, for those who know their history, Viscount Godric served a very brief period, I believe it was 1827, just over 100 days. So obviously no one wants to be in that position. I think the Tories want to choose someone that will obviously be able to beat Jeremy Corbyn, because the way things stand, no one really knows when the next general election would be. The whole concept of fixed term parliaments is, I think, has went out the window because of Brexit. So it could happen this year, it could happen next year, it could happen at the scheduled time of 2022. Um, I'm not really sure what a general election would achieve. If Corbyn lost again, then it's very hard to see how he could remain Labour leader. If he won and became Prime Minister, there is a huge question mark over what Labour's actual position on Brexit is. There's been a lot of, frankly, vagueness. There's obviously staunch Labour Remain people who are now part of Change UK. One misconception I think about Brexit is that it's purely a right wing Tory domain. There are many people on a pretty well to the left who are also sceptical of the EU, but for different reasons. But that's maybe for another video. So without further ado, let me talk about some of the candidates that have been named. Boris Johnson. Okay, Johnson is almost certainly the most famous and well known of the candidates, of the potential candidates among the public. I think that goes without saying. He's a larger than life figure, he's colourful, he's charismatic. I think he's smarter than people give him credit for. I think there's this perception he's a bumbling clown, but I think he's quite a smart guy. I mean, he's published several history books. And not any fool can put a book together. I think it takes a degree of intelligence. I think the problem that Johnson has is precisely that, his charisma. A lot of Tories, I think, don't entirely trust him. They think he's a bit of a flip flopper, or they feel that his ego is perhaps bigger than his gravitas. I feel that that may be an Achilles heel. There's no doubt he's experienced. I mean, he ran London for 8 years. He was foreign secretary. His tenure as foreign secretary wasn't overly successful, although he did take a tough line on Russia, which was, I feel, one of the stronger aspects of the May premiership. Um, but I think with Johnson, there's kind of, it's that outsider thing. And whilst I would never want to compare him to Churchill or Lloyd George, I think that would be pushing the boundaries a little bit. There's always been a mistrust of outsiders, of people who kind of stand out from the establishment. Not that Boris Johnson is a Robin Hood figure, he's definitely not. But I don't know. I don't think that the country. I often hear people say, "Oh, imagine Boris Johnson in charge," or imagine. I don't really have that feeling. I think he would be. I think he's a capable leader. I mean, he did run London for 8 years, and I feel his mayoralty was relatively successful. Um, certainly knife crime was lower during his tenure than it is now. So there's aspects that can be seen as strong for Johnson, and he's already a well-known figure abroad, so there'd be no danger of an obscure prime minister bringing us into obscurity. I think you need a well-known figure to run a major world power. So all those things, I think make Johnson more of a heavyweight candidate. Philip Hammond. Hammond, despite the fact he's one of the most experienced ministers out there, I mean, he served as Defence Secretary, Foreign Secretary, and now Chancellor. Um, he's a little bit boring. Spreadsheet Phil. He's just a bit boring. I think he's capable. I think he's an experienced politician. Um, he's in his early 60s, so the age isn't. He's not too old. I think actually on that point, I think leaders are getting older anyway. I think, people are living longer, so what may have once been seen as older is now not that old in politics, especially when you consider the potential American candidates will all be in their mid 70s. So I think the thing with Hammond is he just doesn't seem that ambitious. I don't think he particularly wants it. He's never indicated that he's seeking the top office. He's never indicated, he's never been seen as as a schemer or anything like that. He is a Remainer, or he's perceived to be a Remainer, which I think could be a big Achilles heel. I do think probably the next Prime Minister should be a Leaver. And I'm saying that as someone who voted Remain, simply because I do respect that side of the argument that these people make, that the person presiding over Brexit probably should be a Leaver. Although I would want a moderate Leaver as opposed to someone like Jacob Rees-Mogg. So Philip Hammond, prominent politician, but perhaps the fact he is a bit boring could actually be a strength. Maybe, I remember when Francois Hollande became the French president, he said, I would be president normal. Well, his tenure was actually pretty turbulent with terrorist attacks, with scandal. Philip Hammond, I don't think he would be a disastrous leader. I think he's capable. He's obviously smart. I just don't think he has the ambition. Jeremy Hunt, again, experienced politician. He was the longest serving health secretary of modern times. A controversial health secretary, it has to be said. He will be a toxic name still to many junior doctors and nurses, understandably so. My issue with Hunt is very recent, and that is his weakness on China, along with Theresa May. This Huawei thing, I really feel, frankly, quite angry about it because I feel that we are basically letting the Chinese walk over us. Yeah, this is the eyes cover today. US threat to sever links with British intelligence over this Huawei thing. I mean, we're letting ourselves be pushed around by the Chinese, and now one of our major trading partners, the United States, is threatening to sever intelligence ties. I mean, this would be disastrous for Five Eyes cooperation. Australia and New Zealand have also warned us about this. Jeremy Hunt, as Foreign Secretary, takes a large part of culpability, along with the Prime Minister, and perhaps along with Philip Hammond, for going ahead with this, basically giving the Chinese a green light. I absolutely do not trust Huawei. I do not trust the Chinese state. They could give as many assurances as they like. They're professional liars. I do not trust the Chinese state. So um, I don't think Hunt's been an overly strong foreign secretary. He has been outspoken on a few issues, or rather, he has spoken out. Not sure if we would say outspoken, but he's spoken out, for example, about the persecution of Christians. I give him credit for that. But there was deafening silence on the Brunei issue. There's too many glaring issues, not to mention Saudi Arabia. And okay, you can argue that all foreign secretaries have been passive on those issues. I want to see a foreign secretary with guts who actually speaks out and isn't afraid to be controversial. Someone like Gavin Williamson, for that matter. I think Hunt's experienced. He's almost a perfect age if you look at the median age of prime ministers. Um, I think he's smart. I think he could be a capable leader, but that's my big issue with Hunt. I think he's just too. I don't think he's been a very strong foreign secretary, and you tend to look at potential candidates from the last big job. Um, then we look at who else do we have now? Michael Gove. Michael Gove, of course, has been demoted in the May era. Again, he's a well-known politician. He's no doubt very intelligent man. I think the thing with Gove is he's seen as a Machiavellian character, and whilst that can have strengths in politics, if it's too obvious, it can also be a weakness. I think he's just not trusted ever since that betrayal of Boris Johnson. My personal issue with Gove is, as Education Secretary, his stance on trying to push for a more Asian style education system. Now, having taught in East Asia, I really don't think it's something we should replicate. That's perhaps for another video to go into depth on, but um, I do not think that hot housing children, I do not think that an obsession with exam results is the right way forward. Um, so that's an aspect of Gove I did not want to. Also, he took very strong lines in his statements on crime. I mean, he's pro death penalty. He gave the impression of being pretty conservative on those issues. Yet, as Justice Secretary, there was moments where he had any sort of like judges need to be more in touch with the public. There's no moments that stood out where Gove really, frankly, made any significant mark. And okay, it was a short tenure, but I do think these things matter. I do think that the record matters. Um, can I say him as prime minister? I don't know. I think he's smart enough. I think he's experienced enough, but I don't think he's going to be in office. I just don't think he's trusted by his party, and that goes without saying. You need to be trusted by your party. Um, then we come to other figures. Jacob Rees-Mogg. Now I know he's the backbencher's favourite. The man himself has said he doesn't want to run. He's in his late 40s, so he's still got time in the future. He doesn't want to run, so if we take his word for that, then he doesn't want to run. Also, he's a backbencher, and it's extremely rare for a backbencher in a sitting government to elevate the prime ministership that fast. It's happened a few times, but I mean, Tony Blair had no ministerial experience, just shadow ministerial experience, but he was the leader of the opposition. So I don't see Jacob Rees-Mogg in number 10. I think it's kind of like a fantasy of backbenchers. I don't think it's going to happen. And I certainly wouldn't want to see Jacob Rees-Mogg in there. Um, I mean, he, to me, demonstrates everything that is wrong with the Conservative Party. Sajid Javid. Okay, I think Javid has been quite a strong Home Secretary. I think he's taken a strong line on Islamism. I think he has been outspoken on issues that he needs to be outspoken on. And as a Home Secretary of Asian background, it's very important that he has spoken out. If for no other reason, and no one can say that he is being racist towards other Asian men. Now, some will say there were some ugly smears when he came in that he was, apologies if this offends anyone, but an Uncle Tom, that he was a coconut, a minority man who was, getting into the white establishment. In itself, that's a major achievement. He is basically, along with Sadiq Khan, the highest ranking ethnic minority in British history, unless I'm mistaken. That's something. So he clearly has something. One of his flaws, it's been said, is he also is a little bit boring. He's a little bit like Hammond. He's smart, he's capable, but he just doesn't really excite. He doesn't make grand speeches. Some might say he lacks vision. I think he's been quite strong Home Secretary. I'd like to see him a bit more outspoken on crime issues, but as for the first Asian man to be Prime Minister, I take a view on this. If someone is a British citizen, if they love this country, if they have proven themselves in politics, I don't care if they are black, white, or Asian. If they're a British citizen, I think that they should have the right to get to the top. If they prove themselves, if they, based on merit, I don't think that he should be excluded because of the colour of his skin or the fact that he's a Muslim now about that, because it's very important. The point about Sajid Javid is yes, he's from a Muslim background, but he's secular. He's hardly an Islamist, and neither, for the record, is Sadiq Khan. So I certainly don't lose sleep over this idea that it would kind of be a closet way for an Islamist to get into number 10. Yes, he's from a Muslim background. I don't think he's an Islamist. And one thing I do find reassuring about Javid is he hasn't been afraid to say that there are problems in our midst. He hasn't been politically correct and said, oh, at least not on the crime issue. On Islamism, I would like to see him being more vocal, but I think he's been better than Sadiq Khan, at least. But, I do want him saying there is such a thing as Islamism. Islamic extremism is a reality. We cannot always take this attitude of, oh, it's got nothing to do with Islam. I want to see him being outspoken on that. Do I see him as Prime Minister? Maybe not just yet. I think he would be a potential Prime Minister, but one. So maybe the next Prime Minister. Other figures among the women. Okay, this is going to be a little bit controversial, but I think people may be reluctant to have another woman succeeding May. Now, it shouldn't be that way, but I think that there might be. I think we still are not entirely used to the idea of a woman prime minister. It's kind of Well, we're used to it, but what I mean is it's still, I don't want to say novelty, but there's still, the media still obsesses about it. They still make a thing of it. So I think that whilst it shouldn't be the case, another woman would have that, oh, well, you're a woman succeeding May. It shouldn't be an issue, but I think somehow it would be turned into an issue. I don't think it should be an issue, but I think it would be. But of the women who have expressed interest, um, Amber Rudd is a Remainer. That could be her big Achilles heel. She's the current Work and Pension Secretary now. If you saw my video on Stephen Smith, I very closely scrutinise the attitudes of every Work and Pension Secretary, and I think unless they make significant changes in that department, then I would have real skepticism about them at the very top. Someone who cannot show compassion to the most vulnerable people in society. Um, I think Amber Rudd is tough. I think she handled herself well at the leaders' debate when she stood in for Theresa May. Um, she was an okay Home Secretary. There was, of course, a whole Windrush scandal. Although, to be honest, I think on some level she was scapegoated for that. Um, an interesting background to Amber Rudd. She actually, no, don't know if anyone realizes this. Next time you watch the comedy Four Weddings and a Funeral, look at the credits. She actually had something to do with the wardrobe department. It's just a bit of trivia. It's not got really any significance, but she actually is credited in Four Weddings and a Funeral. Amber Rudd. Um, I think she's a little bit better known now to the public. Liz Truss, capable politician, but I think it was Liz Truss recently who was saying that she faces sexism every day. And apologies if I've got this wrong. I think it was Liz Truss. Now, I take a very dim view of women politicians who constantly play the sexism card. I'm not saying it doesn't exist, but this notion every time a man disagrees with me, it's sexism. I take a very dim view of that. I want a tough person running the country. I want someone who isn't going to be that thin skinned. And I think to her credit, it's one thing that May can't be accused of is playing the sexism card. When May's had a very, very rough time, not once has she said it's because I'm a woman. So I give her credit for that. Some of her colleagues I can't say that for. I believe Liz Truss was um, saying that recently that she faced sexism almost every day. Well, I'm sorry, if you're going to interpret every time a man disagrees with you, I just find it hard to believe that men are constantly talking down to her. I just don't believe it, to be quite honest. Um, Esther McVeigh, not a chance in hell. I'm biased here. Esther McVeigh, I think, was an appalling work and pension secretary. She epitomises everything about callous Toryism. Please, 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 fate, don't put that woman into number 10. Um, then we have figures like Dominic Raab, Matt Hancock, Stephen Barclay's even been named. The problem here is recognition. The general public haven't heard of most of these people. And in this era of media recognition, that may have worked in the 20s when, although the print press was really, expanding rapidly, people still didn't have the news medium, the television medium, social media. I think it matters. Now, someone like Jeremy Hunt, Boris Johnson, Michael Gove are well known figures. I would say the average person in public, even if they're not that political, will have heard of them at least. They won't have heard of Dominic Raab, Matt Hancock, Liz Truss, or Stephen Barclay, or Gavin Williamson. I quite like Gavin Williamson. I like the fact he was outspoken on Russia and China, but he's still a little bit untested. I can see Williamson as Prime Minister, but one. So that's the analysis. This was a bit longer than I expected, but there was a lot to cover. I'm not a Tory, as if this wasn't obvious. I'm not a Tory, but I'm also a realist. I know the next Prime Minister, unless Jeremy Corbyn wins the general election, will almost certainly be a Conservative. Um, what I want to see in a Prime Minister is someone who's tough, that goes without saying. I want someone who's a little bit controversial. I want them to be a bit outspoken on certain issues. I don't want them to be overly boring and overly safe. I think one issue in this country is our last four prime ministers have been safe. They've been controversial in their own ways on policy matters, but they haven't been outspoken. And I think that political correctness, refusal to call a spade, is infuriating. It's dishonest, and I don't consider it integrity. I consider it to be, frankly, political, politically cowardice, because you need to be outspoken on, for example, pan-Islamism. Um, there's still too much political correctness. There's still too much pandering to identity politics. Um, a little bit of populism is needed, but not if it's hurting the most vulnerable people in society. I mean, Cameron's populism was to attack on the unemployed. I've no respect for that, but I don't know. I do want a prime minister that isn't afraid to be a bit controversial, like David Lloyd George. Um, I want a prime minister that will absolutely stand up to Russia and China. Now, this May gets it half right. She stood up to Russia. She has bent over for China. And I'm very unhappy about that. I want, for once, to see a prime minister speaking out against China and not giving a damn what the arrogant Chinese embassy has to say. We need to stand up to Beijing. And frankly, in the Cameron May years, we have been bending over backwards for that regime. On foreign policy matters, that to me is one of the most glaring issues. Yeah, we need to look at Russia, but May has been quite tough on Russia. We also need to look at China. They may not have committed a nerve agent attack on our soil, but make no mistake about it, the Chinese are trying their level best to undermine Western democracies. So I want to see a prime minister that will stand up to China for once, and I don't see it among any of the current candidates except possibly Gavin Williamson. And even he, it's hard to know. He's untested, and he is not going to be the next Tory leader. I don't trust Jeremy Hunt, Michael Gove, possibly Boris Johnson might do it. I don't know. But I want to see a prime minister with backbone to stand up to China. It's all very well condemning the likes of Brunei, and that's important. But I also want to see a powerful country like China challenged. So that's my analysis. I also want a prime minister that will. I mean, okay, this really comes down to what is your policy preferences. For me, crime is a big one. I want to see a prime minister being vocal about the need to include the public in justice and to be more in touch with the public on justice, and not afraid to criticize judges. We have this idea in this country that, um, you know, judges cannot be criticized, or rather, they should be. If a politician does it, they're interfering in the law. No, I think the job of politicians is to be accountable to the public and to represent the public's concerns. Now, judges, anyway, I'm going off on a tangent. So that's my analysis. Almost half an hour. I'm going to have to round this up. Let me know your thoughts.